And thank you very much to every one of our invited guests, the audience, and our special guest and special speaker, Dr. Manjuru Kabir. You're welcome. It's a great pleasure to have you with us, and we at the Jindal Center for the Global South, we are honored to have every one of you join us for this August event. Our guest is set to speak to us, and we are also set to listen to him and to be part of this very important discussion. Without wasting our time, I'm going to introduce our guest, and then I'm going to hand over the floor to him for him to present to us what he has for us today. Let me just give you a brief bio of the special guest that we are here to listen to. Dr. Kabir is a political scientist. He's a human rights, rule of law, gender, and intersectionality expert. He's a senior advisor. He's a senior advisor and global team leader for gender equality and disability inclusion at United Nations Women Headquarters in New York. Prior to this, he was a senior rule of law policy advisor and chief of Asia Pacific section with UN Women at headquarters at the UN headquarters. Among others, he has experience in leading the development of UN Women's approach to inclusive South-South and triangular cooperation and disability inclusion also. Previously, he was at United Nations Development Program Practice Team Leader, and he was also the policy advisor for governance and human rights for Europe and Central Asia. Dr. Kabir served as the global policy specialist at the United UNDP headquarters at New York. While being there, he led its governance knowledge management portfolio. He also served as UN lead legislative advisor to the Afghan National Assembly. Amongst his experience also, he has led democratic governance portfolio for UNDP Bangladesh and was instrumental to develop inclusive governance and criminal justice sector reform programs. He has authored several books, numerous research articles, blogs, edited several papers in international journals, newspapers, and opinion portals on a wide range of critical global issues. He passed his master's in international human rights law with distinction from University of Essex in the United Kingdom, and he also earned his PhD in politics and aid effectiveness from the University of Hull, UK. He can be followed on Twitter at mkabir2011. We are privileged, we are honored, and we are so glad to have you with us. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Dr. Manjuru Kabir.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you very clearly.
Thank you very much and very kind introduction. It's always a pleasure to connect. I think I had one opportunity before on more of a South-South cooperation issues, but on this specific area, in a month where in New York we just finished the Commission on the Status of Women, and many of you probably know that the focus of the Commission was more of digital divide and how innovation and information technology can make a difference in the lives of millions of women all over the world. And that was one of the core theme for Commission on the Status of Women. But also this month, many countries in the world were celebrated International Women's Day, and the whole issues of digital divide becomes key priority discussion in many parts of the world. And I know that our theme today, as I was requested whether we can discuss, is gender inequality in Africa as part of your perhaps regional discourse. I will probably spend a few minutes on the theme and some of the highlights, and then maybe we will open up for discussion. I certainly cannot claim that I know most of the information about it because it's a huge topic. It's a big continent, and for global organizations like UN Women or other UN entities who are working in Africa, and many of whom are on the ground and we are in touch, closely in touch, and connected to them. It's not that the challenges and of gender inequality in Africa is unique, because some of these we see in Asia as well, in South Asia, you name it. Many of the challenge problem of lack of empowerment or lack of access are not unique to Africa, certainly. And I just came from a meeting I joined in Moldova virtually, of course, and that is probably one of the few good things, if I may say so, out of the whole pandemic process, that you have the agility of the international organization, national organization, governments across our all academic institutions have become much more now in terms of reducing the cost of travel and then connecting to different. So in Moldova, we were discussing exactly somewhat similar, where UN Women, UNDP doing it together in terms of challenges women face in terms of access, and also particularly some of the vulnerable groups, as they call it, are confronting, and what are the innovative solutions coming up in Moldova. And what I heard just the study, that some of the stigma and discrimination and abuse women in Moldova faced because of who they are, or because of a specific disability or belonging to any specific ethnic groups, is not. It's something you will find in other part of the world, including Africa. Now, I just want to set the context to give who are participating today in this discourse for an idea. Women are responsible for 60% of work done globally. Yet if you think about earning just 10% income and 1% in poverty. In Africa, 70% of women are excluded financially. The continent has a $42 billion financing gap between men and women, which is quite staggering. And I was looking at McKinsey's Power of Parity report, Advancing Women's Equality in Africa. Africa's gender parity stands now 0.58. One would be the full parity. For the continent to achieve full parity could be 140 years without any drastic action. Now, closing the gender gap for women and girls in all spheres of life is urgent globally, and it is something decided as a priority for most of the countries, because as we experience as human rights practitioners, gender is often not seen as politically as sensitive as human rights, right? And so there is the attraction, but then what is happening is we have gained some inroad in political participation, as we experience in different countries, legislative bodies, number of women representation, also in local governance has increased. But what we are not seeing, their access has increased dramatically anywhere in terms of financial access. And the financial access has become a key make or break situation because it impacted all other areas. If you think about even girls who are at risk of being left behind, millions are not in school, and 4 million girls would never set foot in a classroom. Now, the disadvantage faced by African women and girls in education and training start in many early years. And that is the reason why it basically set a pattern. I'll tell you one thing, and which might be a small offset, but sometimes it's not prioritized by policymakers. I recently worked with a group which called Global Fund for Widows, and they're focusing on Africa. And they're saying the staggering number of women who are widows in Africa lost their inheritance to poverty, because after the death of their respective spouse, they have no way access to the property. There was many of them thrown out of the family. Many of them never had access to the wealth used to be owned by their respective spouses who were dead. And as a result, they disinherited, and their children were also disinherited. And they were coming up with a number of over 100 million widows globally, and particularly Africa is on spotlight. And that group was so powerful in their advocacy and some of the data they're coming up with. And we had an interaction because that was a kind of hidden gender issue, not prioritized in the policy. I'm just giving you an example, and there could be many examples because different age, different levels. And another challenge also, they're saying that in terms of leadership, where 30% of the leadership possibilities, people are born with different type of leadership potential, right? And then based on empirical evidence, they're saying that 70% depends on your environment, your education, your upbringing. And in Africa, if you look at the school enrollment and some of the challenges, early challenges that girls are facing, because they never got that opportunity to be in the school, their maturity or potential development in terms of capacity and the knowledge and being able to enter the job market never happened, right? And as a result, they becomes a part of the status quo situation where you have women who are delivering the most of the work on the care work, unpaid care work, and other work in the family are not never economically calculated or recognized. And as a result, there is a vicious circle of discrimination and deprivation as well. Now, I don't want to talk only about the problem and the challenges, because certainly Africa has its own share like any other continent. As I mentioned, like Asia, South Asia, I just spoke about Europe, which has its own unique set of challenges, North America, and some of the, even the voting and the participation decision that happened and achieved in North America were not necessarily 100 years ago, right? Where women couldn't vote even. Now, Africa as a continent, of course, demonstrated its political commitment to promote gender equality and empowerment of women. As I mentioned, almost all African countries ratified the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination against Women, which is popularly known as CEDAW, right? And most of them, I think more than half of the African countries already ratified African Union Protocol on the Rights of Women in Africa, which is also an important regional instrument, CEDAW is the overarching framework for all globally, all over the world as part of human rights mechanisms and standard setting process. But then protocol on the rights of women in Africa is also extremely important both for political reason, but also it advances CEDAW significantly. Now, those type of government commitment, national planning process are looking good. But I think the challenges becomes much more when you are going for implementation at the national level and more importantly, subnational and local level. If you ask the organization where I'm working now, but I also look at our interrelation with other UN agencies, one of the challenges we within even UN Women or beyond as a UN system we grapple is economic participation, economic empowerment. Although if you ask me, the face of whole gender discourse sometime in media demonstrated through gender-based violence, which is a key issue and key challenge, not only for Africa, but for many parts of the world. But if you look at some of the underlying root cause, one of the biggest challenge is lack of economic empowerment or lack of economic participation. If you don't have access to capital, if you don't have access to bank or banking institution, access to credit, access to economic participation and different type of opportunities, capital, it is extremely difficult even to break the cycle of physical abuse as well. In the family, outside, in your community, because you are dependent for capital gain or dependent to access to financial resources. And that is where I think Africa is struggling the most. It's not my personal opinion. It's based on data, based on African Union findings. It's based on UN findings and based on African government findings. And as a result, like SDGs, they have their own continental development goal. And in those goals also it is recognized. So that is one of the key issues I would just highlight. But that is extremely linked with the whole issue of poverty and then the issues of stigma and abuse and violence, particularly gender-based violence. Because if you look at just the girl-child issues in Africa, the son preference is nothing unique in Africa. That is something in South Asia we also saw. But then for girl child to being enrolled in the school and harness the full potential of their or economic emancipation or leadership potential, or just simply getting a job in the competitive market has become much more challenging compared to a boy. I'm not suggesting that men or boy don't have discrimination at all, but boys have also significant other challenges in many parts of Africa where they're picked up for, particularly in the conflict zone, they're picked up for as a child soldiers, child fighters, and that has become a big challenge for many boys who unfortunately reach early adulthood because of their use of as in the conflict. That has become a big challenge for boy, which fortunately doesn't affect girl in that specific context. But of course, impact of conflict is something which resonated well in the community, in the family. Mm-hmm. That's one. And another aspect in terms of economic participation, which I sort of considered as one of the highlight for my brief presentation here today, is in the supply line or supply chain for most of the private sector growth that Africa is experiencing. Often women are participating, but not necessarily being appreciated in the community or in the family. One of the reasons is sometimes some international agencies, some governments are prioritizing women's training or capital development as a response to the lack of economic access, but they're not necessarily also tackling the issues of social parity, meaning you might have a good economic empowerment training for women, for a certain group of women of a certain country or a village. But if you don't provide that similar training to their male counterpart, the lack of appreciation of women's training or newly earned skill often doesn't happen in community or at home, right? And as a result, you might be well trained and trying to open a shop or access to your local banks, but you face a lot of hurdles because of community and family are not necessarily supportive to you. So that's one thing we are seeing, that whatever capacity development plan or early intervention plan that governments or local governments or international agencies or regional institutions like African Union are planning to do has to be really comprehensive and target or different gender segments of the society, not only women. It has to be also coupled with male in a very, very strategic way, so that there will be a flow of information shared across gendered function, because in society is quite dynamic. And it has its own status quo and own challenges as well. So understanding the cultural challenges and bottlenecks would be critical. And I'm not saying that culture would be something that has to be prioritized, because the culture and human rights dimension is quite complex, like any other region in Africa. And we should not frame this discussion of women's rights and culture as either or fashion, because formulation sometimes evoke the whole broader discussion of universalism and relativism as inherently conflicting, because you have human rights discourse or gender discourse in Africa, then you have rights, and then you have the discourse of local practices, culture, custom, nothing new. It's happening over the period of time. And as a result, many societies really are very, very keen or very touchy-feely about their local traditional practices, less so for emancipation of human rights or gender. Now, I'm not pointing finger to a particular continent, but this is happening systematically, and it really have a negative impact on the women's human rights agenda as well. So to sum up some of my thought that I wanted to share today with you is, one is, of course, the bigger issue on economic participation and empowerment issues, which has a direct impact on gender-based violence and lack of participation in education and other areas. I'm not saying that that is the only reason or that is the cause. All I'm saying that really contributes to directly as women face the power and the lack of parity in society, in their workplace, and in their education sphere and everywhere. That's one thing. Now, how do you really move the needle? And in many communities, what they really improved some of the situation that I described through the intervention of both of the education and economic empowerment. So it has to be combined, because we have seen many of our organizations who promoted child education and early enrollment, and then incentive for sending your young daughter or a young person to schools or colleges, sometimes doesn't pay the dividend that one expect, given that it's not sometimes combined with support to the economic career transition, or access to credit, access to loan, access to different type of economic facilities. So you might have an education, then you are not getting a job, or you might be then the rate of child marriage is quite high, like in South Asia, in Africa, many countries, child marriage is quite prevalent. So as a result, your investment in education may not yield the result that you're expecting, right? So it has to be combined with also economic participation as well. That sometimes doesn't happen, and sometimes it happens not as a parallel strategy, as a separate thing, or sometimes it happens as an afterthought. And if that happens separately, it may not connect always as one expects. So that becomes also challenging. And then, of course, the whole issue of, I mentioned about conflict and the challenges for boy, but peace and conflict agenda, women peace and security agenda in Africa is also an important aspect I just want to highlight, given that many of the continent's countries are grappling with conflict, and sometimes they deal with D0 government, D0 authorities in many parts of a country. And in their dealings with that, sometimes they're caught between these fighting groups, and they became also disempowered, marginalized, and sometimes they had to bear the burden of entire care burden, and also serving those who are in conflict. They abandon the family. As a result, the economic uncertainty. So there is a price tag, heavy price tag for any conflict that happens. Sometimes it's not evident in media, because it is quite, and it's happening in the households level, in the community level. The sons who are fighting in a conflict zone, or the husbands who are leaving the family behind, are also leaving a heavy economic burden on the shoulders, which women are carrying without recognition, without economic impact really assessed the way we would probably want them to be, and understanding their value and contribution. That doesn't happen always. So I just want to probably take a pause for now, so that I understand if there is any specific questions, or you want me to highlight any other specific area. Maybe that would be a good way of progressing this discussion further.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Kaber. indeed, you've opened the very major points that gives thoughts to the perspective of those of us already already experienced or even seen firsthand what it is for genders in Africa and the south part of the world, global south part of the world to really struggle as to where they find their shoulders in terms of equality. If any of us among the audience have any question to ask, please, the floor is open. Any question, any contribution, any comments?
My name Manjurul.
Thank you.
Yeah, a raging debate in India is a drop in female work participation. You would have thought that with growth in GDP and general expansion of the economy, that there would be more women drawn into the labor force. But what we find, and this is puzzling people, is that the female work participation in the labor force is coming down, and various explanations are offered. Many of them have to do with say, culture, to say that if a farmer becomes prosperous, he withdraws the wife from working as a labor in another person's land. And so the person then reports that she's not working, even though their work burden may have increased. They may have, instead of one buffalo to look after, they may have to look after 5 buffaloes, but it's their own buffaloes, and therefore they report that they are not in the labor force working when you do these surveys. So I wonder what you're from, South Asia, and the image that we have of African women is that, it's all marketplaces in African towns. It's the women who are, doing the selling, and they are very prominent in that role. You don't find that in South Asia. So I just wondered if you have some reflections that might kind of contrast what's happening in South Asia with what's happening in Africa. There are commonalities, differences.
No, thank you very much, Sudarshan, and what an absolute pleasure to see you also. It's a very, very interesting question, because I was talking to someone in US, and in a number of states, the women's employment rate or labor participation was dropping, and I was asking what could be the reason. The explanation I got, even from the North American perspective, where there's 2 things. One is this, of course, as a family, they are making decision in terms of the access to social benefit. If you are not employed in a household both, and then your access would be increased. So that's one calculation they have. Then also, of course, there are other schemes. What you were saying in terms of Africa and the visibility of women in the marketplace, I was working with a big, with a joint partnership with UN and a big multinational company. I would not name the company for the sake of just not to avoid attention to them unnecessarily. But in their supply chain, when a lot of African women were working, what we realized that they are part of the supply chain, they're working, but they not necessarily manage to sustain the capital gain. So as a result, you see, as Sudarshan rightly mentioned, that to us, the visibility of women in the marketplace is quite prominent in Africa. But what is not happening is the sustaining this capital and resulting into something more concrete or longer term. So as a result, they're gaining daily earning from the marketplace, or their participation in the supply chain, but not necessarily resulting into something that's long-term sustaining. And that contributes to the small example I gave. Some of the African widows are facing of the disinheritance is also linked to that, because the moment they lost their spouse or they are thrown out for some reason from the family, they don't have any capital gain, and they have this work, so they were unable to sustain on their own in terms of entrepreneurship. So that's why one of the intervention was, okay, you are part of the supply chain, you are participating in the market-based intervention, but then how do you really manage your savings? How do you really turn your savings into something more concrete, whether you have you own something, your ownership, or your access to bank, your capital processes, whether you're taking loan or turning loan into something, your asset. And that is missing. If you compare that in South Asia is also not monolithic, because we had different interesting challenges what Pakistan is facing, or India has, or Bangladesh has different. Bangladesh, we saw that very prominent women participation in the labor force because of the class structure also in Bangladesh, where you have a very now it has been changed quite after COVID and the whole economic economic challenges that all countries facing, whether it is north and south. But when we are comparing with Pakistan, we saw that the less middle class and lower middle class participation, whereas in Bangladesh there's a very vibrant and active middle class, and women's participation is much higher. And as a result, in Pakistan you have women's capital gain at the higher end, upper class, and then those who own land and much more sort of access to resources have a different trajectory than those who are at the bottom. And when you compare that to Bangladesh, where you have a lot more active, vibrant women's participation, whether be it in the garments or other areas, their participation in the supply chain goes beyond only their contribution through the supply chain. It also added their own small savings and owning a capital, which didn't happen in the same level in Pakistan. And that explained a little bit of the economic shock that Pakistan is facing now because of the whole economic transition, and some part is different from other South Asian countries. And you raised the class, also very good example from India that the women's participation is dropping. So I would not call it a specific Indian or South Asian situation. This is where happening in other part. I just mentioned that I just participated in a sort of a session in Moldova, who did a very interesting data collection, and they're presenting. So it's a joint initiative, UN Women and UNDP in Moldova, and focusing on women with disabilities and women with, particularly on gender-based violence. And what they're saying that because most of the women who are living outside Chisinau, the capital, they don't have access to financial services, and they're denied in the job and the transportation services. When they need a taxi or a public transportation, most of them are not accessible, and it's of course pointing to a different type of challenges of accessibility. But what we are saying, seeing this, one thing is physical accessibility, but then also your accessibility to these services are absent in a number of European countries. So that also has a impact women are facing. Now, as for the popular trend is, you have a lot more progress globally. Women's are more empowered because of their formal rights. That's the formal picture. But the informal picture, what we are seeing is also because of the economic shock, many families are making a decision in terms of what is the price of care work, and how do you balance between an employment and how do you manage the care work. And that is a very difficult decision, and sometimes it happens against women predominantly because of the decision-making process in each family, and which is also male-dominated. So that could be one. I'm not saying or suggesting that this is not informed by or participated in by women, but many cases their participation is uneven, right? And that is the trend. So I agree with you that we are also seeing the drop in labor force participation, and there are different type of explanation coming in. But I think also the global economic shock that is happening across the world has a direct impact on particularly the care, unpaid care work role. And my fear is, Sudarshan, that we would see this much worse before it gets better. Because there was a very positive tone a couple of years ago when there are more recognition in many countries of how do you really incentivize unpaid care work, which is taking up a lot of space and time for women globally. But then suddenly there's a backlash now because of the economic meltdown in many countries. And people are looking at, okay, how, as a family, how do you sustain? And typically women bear the brunt of it. And they said, okay, why don't you stay home and take care of these things? And that is your role, you are doing well. And that's the status quo and the mindset. And so it might get worse before it get better, given the society we live in and the economic transition that many countries are experiencing. That would be my immediate response, Sudarshan.
Thank you very much, Manju. Thank you very much, Sudarshan. If there's any other comments, any other contribution, any other question, if I'm allowed to also co-opt as also make a comment, from my experience in Nigeria, I also observed that, and which also gives me concern, that I think the cultural contribution is also strong. However, over the past 10 years, let me say over the past 20 years, I had hoped that education will make some intervention in the cultural aspect of contribution to gender inequality. As a student in the university then, I remember that there are professors, at least I know one or two professors that died. And then the family members came to tell the wife that, look, we have to take the entire property. It's easy for anyone to blame the wife that, okay, what is your own? What do you have as yours? What kind of economic empowerment can you fall back onto? And then when I became a lawyer and I started having experience with counseling women that had this kind of issues, or even in the verge of losing their marriage, the question is always, the man doesn't want me to participate in any economic activity because he feels he can provide for the entire family. When you, as an African man, discuss with some fellow men, they will tell you that, well, if you empower some women, they have the fear of insecurity. So I believe that also the cultural aspect of it is defined even the intervention of education to a large extent in Africa. My question is, if I may, sir, that what efforts are we doing in ensure that, what efforts as civil society organizations and international intergovernmental organizations, what are they doing to recalibrate the level of orientation among both gender in terms of responsibility and in terms of how you understand the role of a man and the role of a woman in the society, in terms of economic parity, economic contribution, economic independence? How do we get that orientation that economic independence should not amount to insecurity in terms of the kind of relationship they have with themselves?
Yeah, it's a quite complex minefield, but I would say that the couple of, in terms of moving forward in that discussion, number of strategies are being adopted in Africa, what I am observing, both by civil society organizations, as you were mentioning, UN system, governments. One is, of course, the big thrust on participation in decision making, including engagement with national electoral processes and parliament. And I have told that there have been progress. If you look at Interparliamentary Union map they published, and we have a discussion with IPU, yes, because of the quota constitutional provision, legal reform, you have more women inside parliament and legislative bodies in provincial councils, in local bodies, which are elected officials, right? But then, of course, that doesn't guarantee that they are really have the real power. If you look at a political party in any country, whether it is in South Asia, in Africa, and the decision-making process within a political party in terms of candidacy, in terms of electoral processes, are not necessarily something women has a lot of leverage in most of the countries. And some of the face, as we see that who are prime minister, presidents, a big position, some of the women are also part of the inheritance process with the male politician, right, coming into power, and then sometimes they're sustaining the status quo as well. I'm not generalizing, but there are examples and experiencing. Now, so there's a big thrust on leadership and capacity development program. And leadership, encouraging women to participate more, to take the leadership position, which has also is public value of it in terms of encouraging girl child to adopt and embrace more public role, as opposed to what was probably happening over a period of time, early child marriage and diminishing their potential in terms of public sector or any other role. Then another, I would say, positive development happening is growing integration of gender in national planning and budgeting process. And that is positive. And I think if you look at even in a perspective of South Asia, India, where you're based in, or others, number of national officials, national bodies, national commission, national budgeting process are looking into how can we enhance women's participation, because everything has a price tag, right? So if in terms of gender responsive budgeting, that has progressed quite a bit. And in terms of the South-South cooperation, I would say that a lot of country-to-country collaboration happening around gender-responsive budgeting, which was quite impressive. That countries from South are learning from each other in terms of the financial planning process and how gender-responsive those can be. And Ministry of Finance, it used to be Ministry of Finance is a standalone technical ministry with a lot of political power in most of the countries. Now, much more interaction and engagement happening by the social sector ministries, which are not traditionally powerful ministries. I'm not talking about only Ministry of Gender, Women Affairs, but if you think about social children and the elderly people and other social inclusion portfolios that happens in many countries. And every country has a different name for it and for them and different ministries. And then discourse that now happening with them and Ministry of Finance used to be more Ministry of Finance telling them, okay, this would be allocation for year, this and that. Now it has been much more progressive discussion happening with Ministry of Finance. So it's no longer a top-down dictation from the Ministry of Finance always in many countries. That is a positive development happening as more sectoral inputs coming into. Also broadening the space for women's participation in particularly Africa. It's extremely relevant in the peace and transition processes. Many countries, whether you name it, even Ethiopia confronted this recent crisis, right, over refugees and women's role. Somalia and in many parts of Africa where have DRC, Rwanda have this conflict and transition places. That is, so there was voice and women's traditional role that you highlighted dictated that they have no role in the peace building process, in the governance mechanisms, and then outcome of the peace process. This is one space many civil society are really making a difference, and that includes African civil society as well. And they are saying that in terms of identification of their voice, their role in the peace process and follow up to the peace process. And it's linked to the reason peace process always immediately told us, oh, it has to be a war. No, not necessarily. There might be a hidden conflict going on for centuries, right? Sometimes people even don't recognize because we become so used to it. And there are different groups, and some are de jure de facto groups happening, and some are so remote that doesn't bring the headline in many mainstream media, whether in Africa or globally. And as a result of their long drawn these conflicts, impact those conflicts on women's life is quite severe. And that's why the African civil society's role in carving out a space for women in some of the conflict decisions in terms of post-conflict transition in the society are extremely important. Then another, I would say that particularly ending violence against women, which is so rampant and prevalent in almost all societies, including Africa. These calls there, we saw the great role of women. And it's not only providing the services, which is extremely important, especially gender-based violence or sexual violence. You have an ability to call for services, access, whether it's a phone number or access to medical health, and then long-term healing process and economic process. There, the role of African civil society and African network of young women are becoming more and more important. And I think that is where our hope is, where the young African women who are becoming much more conscious and taking some of the role, which is not traditional in terms of working with these peace mediation processes, working with technological companies, working with beyond only supply chain, contributing to it, but then also banking institutions. These are the new generation of African women who are probably the beacon of hope for Africa and the gender movement. And it's not only for gender, but it's also human rights, greater gender human rights movement in Africa as well. Because sometimes rights-based movement, one challenge is we have seen that if you, entitlement and the rights is one discourse, but if it is not backed up by economic ownership and economic parity, then you might be given the rights, but then there's very little space to exercise that rights and to sustain the gain. And another thing which is nothing new to our audience and those who are in the room, because all of you had so much relevant background and experiences, is many things we thought that we have achieved, right? And then now open for negotiation, whether it is human rights, whether it is gender, and many customary practices are coming back in the name that we need to protect also our authenticity, our local custom. Nobody is questioning that, but then the whole tension between human rights and local custom and the gender are really coming out on the surface in some countries and some cultures. We thought that some of these are resolved, but it's not resolved. Also, given the rise of the populist politics in many countries, that contributes. I'm not saying that is the sole reason, but that certainly contributes politically. Yes. So those are the things. But so I'm saying that it's a mixed picture, but it's drawn on based on some success, some failure, and some changes. What we are seeing also, I think I will just highlight this for your audience is, given that deep technological penetration that's happening in Africa and many parts of the world, I think there is another bigger area in terms of artificial intelligence and technology and potential bias against certain segments of the society, including women and girls, whether it is a hiring decision, career sustaining decision, firing decision, or job sustenance and growth. And this is a new area, but it's not a unique area, because if you have a discriminatory practices in society, it's only natural that algorithm or all artificial intelligence would also pick up discriminatory language and as something which people would say, okay, this is fine, this is in practice in the society, right? So it's and the amount of technology now most of the companies are using to do the shortlisting, to also understand whether you are you have the mental aptitude for certain job or certain role or leadership role could be beneficial, but could be also, if you are not mindful, also discriminatory. How do you define the potential you have for a certain leadership role, and whether as a women or certain minority or certain groups, whether you have that potential to hold, and how do you making the are you making the decision? I think it's a new discussion happening, but given the deep penetration of internet and mobile technology and dependence on technology we get used to nowadays, that we expect the technology will deliver for us, and therefore this is a new concern and worry among also human rights and gender movement, that this whether are you looking into enough, are you investing enough, and whether people who matter at the end of the day are participating in designing of this technology, whether their participation is there or somebody else is making decision for you. This is good for women, this is good for a particular segment with disabilities, this is good for minorities, so let's do it. And whether we are participating, it bring back somewhat, I'm not comparing the old discussion about when World Bank launched the poverty reduction strategy paper in the late 80s, right? And I'm sure the Sudarshan would know it, and where this big discussion about participation, whether women or poor who are participating in the economic decision making are ready to participate, whether World Bank and IFS have really invested in their making them able to participate, whether they're ready. And that was a big criticism against bank and IFIs. Similar criticism happening with big technological firms today, who are making a huge difference and had a lot of influence over government policy making in most of the countries. Because one thing you wrote, like the early 90s poverty reduction strategies, when IFIs are making a policy prescription and many governments didn't question them, right? They adopted it because it linked to other economic incentive. Similar thing happening now when technology firms are giving a prescription or providing a design to a certain government or certain countries, nobody is questioning them, and there hasn't been a robust discussion and review by the stakeholders. So people are saying, oh, this is coming from Google, this is coming from this company, this is coming from Microsoft, this is coming from all these big giant corporation. They're providing some solution, and whether they are participatory, whether they are ultimately beneficial, and ability for government to question them is also limited because of the lack of capacity and knowledge, and perhaps also big trust are there that, okay, this is good for us because this is technology must be good, right? So similar, these are the two different things. I'm not comparing them, but I'm seeing some strange similar pattern resurfacing, which happened in the 90s, but now also seeing that blind trust, lack of participation, lack of capacity to participate and therefore inform and influence the process. I'm seeing the same repetition. Sometimes we call it history repeats itself. It is happening in a different form, which might have a bearing on both gender, women, and different segments of the societies who will be at the recipient end.
Thank you very much, Manjuru. I believe there should be some persons among our audience that have that contribution or question. Please, anyone? Any contribution, any comments, any question? Okay, if there is none, I'm going to ask a question again. You mentioned the level of participation. Okay, yes. Bishal Chaudhry, yes, please, you have the floor. Thank you.
Hello, sir. Thank you very much for the very good lecture that you've given on gender inequality in Africa. So my question would be regarding what you said earlier about supply chains. Given the fact that some countries in Africa are landlocked and some, geographically speaking, are much more, say, closer to the seas and the oceans, and they have the necessary, topographical qualities to make ports and some other intersections as such. So are there experiences in terms of integrating women into supply chains different due to certain geographical qualities that different countries in Africa have?
Very briefly to respond to this, yes, it's different, but then it's also surprising how similar are they. I have seen, the reason I'm saying similar, I have observed supply chain and of a number of multinational companies where women are being employed, and our particular initiative was how can we increase the number of women. At that time it was by 2020 to how can we raise the level and the participation of women in the supply chain. And as I mentioned, there was one specific challenge was their sustaining capacity, whether they are doing a job and then suddenly the company moved out of that region or the country or the locality and they lost their job, can they sustain through these jobs or work growth. And of course, as you mentioned, that for landlocked countries, there's a little bit different trajectory than those who have access to seas. But it didn't change the fate of women in terms of sea and the port and then where women were able to work. Some of the places where they are only allowed to work very low paid work, and then some of them are hazardous as well, particularly where you have access to sea. The exposure to different hazard is much more sometimes compared to landlocked countries. And of course, there are exposure to hazards can be different in some landlocked countries depending on which industry you are working in. You all know that particularly that there was a challenging circumstance in the extractive industries in Africa, and labor welfare and miners who are working there, and in terms of how the social inclusion and social welfare scheme for those who work in the mining companies, there are a lot more challenges, and the way it impacts women is different in mining companies than those way it impacts perhaps a bottling company or bottlers, right, in across the supply chain. So yes, there is difference, but in terms of the safety and security and women's capacity to absorb and sustain shock absorbance and economic sustenance, you have a strange similarity across the board. When I was also had opportunity to work in the similar supply chain program in Brazil and in Egypt, you would be surprised. Of course, Egypt has a different trajectory in terms of, and local practices made a difference, and challenges is different for women than South Africa or Brazil. These are the countries which has large supply chain exposure as well. Egypt is not that large, but particularly in Brazil and South Africa. So what we have observed that yes, there is similarities, but there were some nuanced cultural differences, obviously. I spoke about Egypt. Egypt is different culturally and by all means compared to South Africa. But you have the similarities in terms of the lack of access, in terms of lack of sustaining capacity, coping mechanisms. Those are the similarities.
Thank you very much, Manjuru. We have another one of our audience, Batika Sharma. Batika Sharma, you have a question for Manjuru?
Yes, sir. Thank you so much. Good afternoon. Thank you so much for your insightful session. I had a question with regards to the sub-Saharan African part, and how the ethnicity plays a role in the gender inequality aspect. As you mentioned that the culture plays a major role in the gender equality when it comes to the fact that the development in Africa was with regards to the woman was even portrayed as and was not appreciated. The work was not appreciated. So what measures should be taken with regards to sub-Saharan African regions, and how can the ethnicity play a role in the development and the gender inequality? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Look, Sub-Saharan Africa is not similar pattern, because if you look at Central African Republic, for example, it has big challenges of conflict. You have Burundi has a different trajectory. Burkina Faso, Botswana is somewhat different, and it has the political governance system is different. Yes, there is this, as you rightly mentioned, that the identity and ethnicity and other aspect played a role, but within even sub-Saharan Africa, the countries which are really ravaged by conflict has different set of challenges than those who are probably emerge out of or not necessarily part of conflict as such. But then you have the whole issue of poverty in sub-Saharan Africa, that discussion. Now, gender inequality is no different. All I'm saying that if you, in terms of the abject poverty, the impact of abject poverty on the life of women is so severe, as I mentioned at the beginning, that they are not necessarily enjoying the access to education and their enabling environment, or the environment that help them to grow, and access to health services are missing there. So as a result, women who are young women who are sort of trying to get enrolled in some of the sub-Saharan African may not sustain their education pathway because there's no support system. Even they are succeeding, but then because of the child marriage and other customary practices, that is not fully, the potential are not necessarily harnessed the way you would expect. And the gender-based violence is severe in many of these countries. That's one thing. And that's not only rooted in African culture, that is rooted in almost like universally. You experience that in every country on earth. That's one thing. And then you have also the preferential treatment in the society and the communities. It's very much there, rooted there as well. Now, some might argue that some of the communities who have women have a greater role and more prominent role. That happen also, but then those are not necessarily the key trend. If you look at the whole population in Africa, and particularly sub-Saharan Africa, I think the whole dynamics of the nexus between poverty and conflict is something sub-Saharan Africa have suffered a lot, because it's almost like a vicious cycle. You have conflict, therefore you don't have access to services, and therefore you are poor, and then you're poor, and as a result of poverty, that also forces you to be part of the long drawn or protracted conflict. So that cycle, breaking that cycle is the big challenge for everyone. And there are areas where success has come in terms of access to financial services, access to economic property, particularly the ownership of it. Where it is not happening, you are seeing the same pattern re-emerging. So I basically I'm saying what you have said, that yes, there's a direct linkages with gender and some of those vexed issues that you mentioned as well.
Thank you very much, Manjuru. Our audience, they've been active so far, and I wish we can have more comments from those that have not contributed at all. If you have any other comments or question, please, you're free to contribute. Any question, any comments, any contribution? I wanted to ask that from your bio, I saw that you've had experience serving as advisor to the Afghanistan National Assembly when they were under civilian rule before the Taliban took over. Just kind of digress from Africa for now. With what's happening in Afghanistan now, what kind of intervention is UN Women trying to bring to bear as to what they think can be acceptable, or they can sell to the current political leaders in Afghanistan that can, if not if not return Afghanistan back to the wonderful work that you and your colleagues were doing and you were able to achieve before the current dispensation, at least give some semblance of hope to the women presently that find themselves in a very hopeless situation?
Sure, thank you. I would not expand on it because this deserves a whole lot of discussion, and many of you know it can goes on for hours. I will just only thing I will say this. There's two things that is my reaction, and I think the a book I wrote, which Macmillan published, had a chapter on Afghanistan where I did mention one area which is so true. When you have reform not backed and deeply penetrated by national of any country, or that doesn't sustain, right? That's our development experience in most of the countries. That's happening. In terms of and that is true to for Afghanistan, where many of the reform were brought in by international community in Afghanistan, didn't sustain because it was not rooted in the society. So that's nothing new, but that is true in Afghanistan. In terms of course, it's a very, very challenging time for women in Afghanistan. I would say most challenging time, and our heart always goes out with them. Our colleagues are working in extremely difficult circumstances as well. So I would not call it the totally doomsday scenario because in the history of mankind, we have seen challenging circumstances on rights and gender in many parts of the world. So I would not call it that there won't be any improvement of the situation at all. We're hopeful because if you meet, as you rightly saying, wonderful Afghan women who are so resilient, and despite all the challenges of conflict and poverty and whatnot, they are working and they're surviving, they're connecting. Many Afghan women who came to join in the Commission of the Status of Women this year, who had the opportunity to interact with them. So many of them are now living in many countries after the current regime came into formal power. Many Afghan women left the country, but deep down inside, they have this unwilling intention to go back. Many are in fact saying that, okay, my daughter went back, she's working in a very difficult situation, still working in some of the media companies, some of the traditional companies. So there is a huge challenge now women in Afghanistan are confronting. At the same time, there is also resilience of Afghan women are happening. Afghanistan have its own say in how they want to progress, but without meaningful participation of women who are so significant in number everywhere, particularly in Afghanistan as well, and who showed so much potential, you can't sustain economic progress and growth. And you are seeing also the economic challenges that Afghanistan is facing as well. Well, some might argue that the economic challenges they have in the before, and then there was all this investment made, which is probably sometimes not always sustainable, because you have the international investment which were there before because of a certain situation. Now, whether those type of international investment would have been sustained without the presence of large international presence because of the conflict in Afghanistan, that's a different question, and that can be discussed at length. But for women, as of today, it's a very challenging time, and I hope that particularly access and participation to education and job and other area, that would come back to them in the same way they expect, because it's ultimately it's their voice and their intention, their willingness, right? We all can support. So if my whole intention is to say that Afghan women should decide their future, and they should be given all opportunities they can have, because when they're competing outside, anywhere in the world, they are showing same sort of competence and resilience like any other women of any of the other countries as well. So it's a challenging time for any organization, including UN as such, but it's also a time where we should not forget about them, because that's another danger. If you look at that world move on from one crisis to another crisis, and the past crisis becomes a past crisis and sometimes forgotten. And some of the Afghan women who came to CSW reminded us of that as well.
Thank you very much, Manjurul. I know we have about 15 minutes left. Any question, any contribution, any comments from the audience?
I think if we close this session, only thing I just want to say in closing that, like your session title was, of course, gender inequality in Africa, and I was asking your colleague that why you are focusing particularly inequality in Africa and why not global? Because the reason I asked that question also because of the so many women leaders who came for recent commission of status of women and the digital divide and lack of or need for innovative practices. You can see that it's a trend everywhere, right? It's affecting women in every country and every region on earth in terms of how do you really increase the participation. Women's labor force participation is one thing, but also their participation in the digitally included society. It's not about whether you have a profile or social media presence. It's also, are you gaining meaningfully out of technological innovation, and whether you are participating in it and benefiting it, and you're influencing the process. And that is not happening in most of the countries, in most of the region. So that's number one. Number two is Africa, in terms of its trajectory, the progress is happening in terms of treaty bodies and human rights bodies, and the formal commitments are quite strong. I think no one is doubting the commitment level in terms of the reporting, in terms of that is happening. Now, in terms of actual implementation, that is lagging behind in most of the region as well. But I think the formal commitment is extremely important because we have seen it has a positive impact on the judicial process. It has a positive impact on the lawmaking as well. And there is a global count on discriminatory laws. And of course, many African countries, like many other countries, have discriminatory laws. So governments are also committing that they will remove those laws. So removal of formal barrier are taking place gradually. We are not there yet. In terms of increased participation of women in the formal sector, because in the informal sector they are there, but that is not recognized. So how do you really transition from informal sector to formal sector? It's something happening. We are still not there, and I think that is the way to go because it links to their economic empowerment, which is critical because we also learn from that access to justice and legal empowerment does not happen if you don't have strong economic empowerment as well. And it has also negative impact in terms of lack of economic opportunity and access, also expose you to much more violence that we are seeing. I'm not saying that if you are economically solvent, you will not experience violence, but I think that you will have much more options to get out of it and to challenge it, as opposed to when you don't have economic option, getting out of it becomes a huge challenge. Then finding a solution or options where you can go, where you can get out of it, where you can report, where you can complain, becomes quite limiting if you don't have economic access to economic services and economic ownership of your wealth So that's the thing. And the third thing is in terms of stigma and discrimination. Many countries have this stigma, or sometimes hidden, sometimes hidden in the name of customary practices, social practices, tradition. And it becomes so day-to-day affairs that people often don't realize this is stigma, this is discrimination. And how do you assess, quantify that stigma and the value of it? So that is something which is very important, and we are doing some testing, piloting in terms of what do you call a stigma, how do you assess it, what is the economic value of stigma and discrimination. And that didn't happen. In the same way, it didn't happen in terms of when people are saying what is the price of care burden, and it becomes so heavy, especially even women who are taking care of children with disabilities for them, or women who has disability, who has chances that they will expose to sexual violence even more. And then the whole the abandonment part by the society, social abandonment, and those type of things. That's why the care burden is extremely important in the care economy, and most countries, including African countries, must look at it. And how do you really incentivize a care burden, formalize it, because it's given and people take advantage of it, but there's no formal recognition of the care burden, and that is really eating up women's time and energy. So I'll stop here.
Thank you very much, Manjuro. It's been a very wonderful time. It's been a very intellectually intriguing time listening to you. And I believe that everyone connected to us as part of this event, they can share the same position with me, that listening to you has really added so much of the limited perspective that we've had before even having this event. We feel honored. We really appreciate your presence. We appreciate the time that you've put into preparing and also coming to deliver your own thoughts to us. And we, from different parts of the world, we have Asians here, we have Africans here, and I believe we have Europeans here also. We are holding on to our thoughts that in any way that we can also make impacts and make our own contribution to what UN Women is doing within the formation of even family setting down to our society and to a larger, broader participation that we can entrench ourselves in, where we do whatever we can to make sure that we make your job to be less difficult than what it is presently now. On behalf of Jindal Global University, on behalf of Jindal Center for the Global South, the director and staff and members of the center, we appreciate you, and we look forward to further interaction, further times we're going to invite you to participate in events like this. Thank you very much, and thank you to our audience. Thank you to everyone.
Thank you very much.
Without you, we wouldn't be here. So thank you very much to everyone that's been part of us. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.